can come through to the witness stand. When you're ready, can you please state your full names?
My name is Derek Swartz.
Do you have any objection to taking the oath?
No, Your
And you consider the oath to be binding in your conscience, on your conscience?
I do.
Swear that the evidence you're about to give is nothing else but the truth, and raise your right hand and say, so help me God.
So help me God.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, my lady. I think the witness is going to be on the stand for some time. I don't know if there's a chair.
By all means, you may sit down if you wishes to. You've already been threatened that you're going to remain in that stand for a long, long time.
Yeah, well, if it's my election, we would have just said we already testified in the TRC evidence.
So he must brace himself.
Yeah, but
Thank you.
Sir, can you please confirm? Is it correct that you are the retired Vice Chancellor of the NMU, the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University?
Well, it's called Nelson Mandela University now,
Yes.
but it's true, yes. I'm retired now from that position.
And when did this?
I think it was 2019. Yeah, 2019.
And just to put everybody in the picture so that everybody can understand the context of everything, is it correct that when you testified at the TRC amnesty, you were at Fort Hagen?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Sorry, I did not get that, Mr. Coltman. You were?
At Fort Hagen University. Or at
All
some
right.
stage you were at Fort Hagen.
That's true.
But at the time of all these incidents that gave rise to this inquest, when the Cradock Four were killed, you were a teacher,
Correct.
young 25-year-old teacher.
I don't know about the young, but certainly 25-year-olds, yeah.
And you were teaching at Western Park High School.
Yes, sir.
So we'll come back to the statements that you made, the evidence that you've given at the TRC itself. But can you just, for the court to understand your background, just give a short synopsis of your career, your profession?
Yes, Your Ladyship. I guess I was born in the Eastern Cape, and much of my life was shaped, growing up in the socio-economic environment, largely around Port Elizabeth, but also for my childhood in the Tsitsikamma region. And I grew up in the 1960s, and then in the 1970s, of course, I was in high school, and it was the throes of as some of you may recall, the struggle against apartheid and in the revolts in the education system and so on. So I went to the University of the Western Cape. At the time it was racially segregated, so we couldn't study, unlike today, where we wanted to, and I did a basic BA degree in all the sort of like general social sciences. And then I came back to Port Elizabeth to teach because the avenues that I originally had set out to do were unfortunately not available for a whole range of reasons that are not particularly relevant right now. And it is in that context, of course, that I became more involved in the events that I guess this inquest is focused on. So,
Yes.
yeah, if that is sufficient.
And after, so when did you stop teaching?
Well, I was stopped
I
from
mean,
teaching.
at school level.
Yes, I was forced to stop there with the state of emergency of 1985 because literally we went underground. I had to flee, abandon my career, and like many others, lived a life literally in the political underground, you know, for 3.5 years. Yeah.
And thereafter?
Well, thereafter I left into exile, I think at the, towards 88, 89. And then I only returned in 1995 where after Madiba's release and so on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So about 10 years. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Now, I'm going to just show you the statements that you'd made in the docket itself, but my lady, I'm going to give copies of his statements that he made. My apologies. We are not handing up the original at the moment, the original docket, as we're still busy with finalizing the complete record. And the statements that I'm handing up are marked A10, I beg your pardon, A10, A65, and A71, and A113.
Is there any objection to the statement being introduced and handed up in court?
It's just provisionally for Malay.
Yes, is there
Just
any
to
objection?
enable it.
Doesn't look like there's any objection.
And I may just confirm that it doesn't implicate any of the persons of interest.
My lady, we do not have any objection, but we unfortunately haven't had sight of
We can have that,
the documents.
My lady, again.
We also don't object, and we're not going to interrupt. Because there isn't a paginated bundle, we're not sure whether we have seen this particular document.
My lady, if I could just, again, as I did on Monday, confirm that the docket containing these statements was sent to each and every one of the legal representatives. In round about August 2024, if necessary, I can get proof.
Yes, I think that is the point Mr. Vani is making, that because there is not a paginated record, he is not certain whether or not they are in possession of the statements. But from what I gather, no one is opposed to
Yes.
the statement being introduced.
Yes, thank you. In any event, my lady, if I can just...
Just make sure that everybody gets a copy of the statement.
Well,
even
as
if
I've
it's
said,
at a later
they do
stage.
have the statements, my lady, but I'll come there.
All right, thank you.
We'll have to discuss it again. So I understand it, they do have it.
Yes, carry on.
Thank you, thank you, my lady. Mrs. Swartz, I'm not going to go into great detail into your statements, but if you can just look at the copy that you have in front of you. Sir.
Oh, this one?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. And you see at the bottom, the last page is, let's start from the bottom, because it was
Yeah.
stapled in that manner. That is the first statement that you made. It was the first investigation officer in this case, Warrant Officer Fani Els.
Else, yeah.
Yes, Stephanus Johannes Els. And it was made, as it appears here at the bottom of the statement, on the 8th of July, 1985.
Yes, sir.
And you confirm that is your statement.
Yes, I do.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
And
So where do you get that, Mr. Coltman?
My
8th of
lady,
July?
at the last page, in fact, of that bundle. At the, that is, your lady will see at the top right-hand corner, it's marked as 810, it's typed out, so that's why.
But
in-
A10, I have A113.
No, that's the It's the first page as it has been stapled of the bundle.
As I see, this one is marked A113 and then in brackets 1.
And if your ladyship just page until the last page,
Last page of the bundle or of that statement.
of the statement.
I still don't see any date.
Right at the bottom, lady, it says the last page. It says there, Port Elizabeth, 8 July 1985. Maybe.
I still can't see the 8th of July. All right. Okay, thank you. That's the typed version of the statement.
Yes.
Yes, Mr.
Okay.
Okay, you need the copy. Your copy back.
You. And, lady, if I can just summarize. Essentially what you stated in this email, maybe apparently the statement, is your conversation with Mr. Mithigoniwe and the arrangements regarding the meeting. Is that correct?
Yes, Your Honor.
And anything else you wanted to add regarding that?
No, I think my statement seemed to be in general a reflection of what my recollection is of a set of conversations that I had with the late Matthew Goniwe on telephone. And at the time, and I think, it's 40 years now since then, and of course we were operating under very difficult conditions. I think back about the time, it was a very difficult time in the political and social history of the country, where the United Democratic Front, in which we were both leaders at the time, had operated under a repressive environment. Still a legal terrain. It operated in a legal space, but highly repressive at the time. And of course, there are a whole series of things I can probably point out to attest to that reality. And so the background to this was that we had to communicate in a way that we could function to carry out the aims of the organization, but we attempted, with not always great success, to communicate and to collaborate in ways that ensured a reasonable degree of safety and security, personal security, and also to secure the organization to survive under then increasingly repressive conditions.
Yes, and it is correct that your, or can I ask, was there any suspicion on your part or other of your comrades' part that the telephone lines might have been tipped?
Yes, it
or that you'd be
yes,
placed under surveillance?
Yes, indeed. We were certainly placed under surveillance, and we know that now from the historical records too. But surveillance could have been physical surveillance. They were literally standing outside of your offices and doors. Often,
You say they, who are you referring to?
The security police, essentially. There might have been other intelligence operatives also. Remember, it wasn't only the security branch or security police. There were also intelligence agencies from different branches of the state, military intelligence, the NIS, I think it was called, National Intelligence Services, and so on. And it was a society that was teeming with a range of surveillance agencies operating at multiple levels, and they were built up over the decades from the 1960s till, in the 80s when we were confronting the power of the state machinery. They also evolved as we evolved. That's really essentially what I'm saying.
Yes.
So the communications that I had with the late comrade Matthew Gqeberha was sort of like mediated by this reality.
Yes.
Took place in the context of this reality of that we were aware of, or at least suspected that our telephones were tapped and so on. So it tended to be very cryptic.
Yes.
And I read a transcript many years after of the tap conversation that I had with him on the day before, I think, he came to PE, to Port Elizabeth, sorry. And I could see in the way that we were talking, we kept it very sort of superficial and in general, very cryptic almost, but we had to communicate that he was coming down to Port Elizabeth and that we had to meet. That's the basic facts. Because of course, those days we didn't have the internet,
Yes.
cell phones, and you couldn't send a telegraph also because it was Dingalile in the middle of nowhere. So the technologies were very rudimentary at the time. But we had to meet because there were some really serious issues that we were going to discuss.
Yes.
And so I guess the long answer to your short question is that I suspect we probably communicated in several ways, certainly by telephone from
Yes.
my place to his place. And then I suspect we might have communicated I was teaching at the time. And, when you're in class, so either he called me or vice versa.
Yes.
During that time to agree on a suitable venue
Yes.
so that I think there must have been one or two conversations during
Yes,
that day.
it is an event, common cause that he did then come to Gqeberha.
Yes.
And the other two statements, the written statements, handwritten statements, are in fact just a repetition of the original statement that you had.
You're referring to the TRC?
No, your statements that you had before.
Yes, of course, yeah. I think it was an explication or a further elaboration on that.
Yes.
But the essential details, are accurately, recorded as far as I
Yes.
can see, Your Honor.
Thank you. My lady, if I can just hand up this bundle, and we're not going to go through these are copies of the TRC amnesty hearings. We're just handing up the copies in the meantime, just to assist the court. And I've placed, your ladyship must just, I just want to remark that under the cover B, the blue cover, you'll find it starts with the evidence of Mr. du Plessis. But I've placed a yellow marker at the page where Professor Swartz's evidence starts. He started giving evidence on the 3rd of June, 1998. And at the bottom of the page, lady will see page 19. And at the time, he was led by the late...
Which part of the bundle are you referring to, Mr. Coltsman?
My lady, that's the bundle. It's undercover. Can I just... it's under the blue cover, yes. There's a yellow marker placed.
There are quite a number of blue markers. B is a
Can I-
blue marker, IJ is a blue marker.
The first blue marker, my lady.
All right.
It's B.
You.
Thank you. And at the bottom, you will see page 19. Your Ladyship will then see, almost right at the bottom, the chairperson then asks Mr. Swartz, have you got any objection to the taking of the oath? And Mr. Swartz, the witness says, so help me God, and that's where his evidence then starts. And he was, at the time,
Which page are you referring to?
page 19 at the bottom, my lady.
19 at the bottom.
At the bottom of the page on the
Yes.
right.
And who is Mr. Duplessis?
That was a previous amnesty applicant. My lady, can I just perhaps get the leave out file? I see it. I see it.
Are all the parties aware of what Mr. Coachman is dealing with now? Mr. Coachman? Yes, Mr. School.
I think everyone is a bit confused to
Yes.
exactly at which page.
Okay,
I'm
let's
certain
take a
at
short
this page.
adjournment. Maybe you can sort it out amongst yourselves. Go to adjourn.
Take the sound off.
Yeah.
Very good.
I just sent it to them as well. I just emailed it to you. You don't. No, I just sent it down. This is talking to
So now we don't know if it's the same. But why is the order different?
Which one are you? Okay, anyway, what are you referring to here? I mean, I've got Fanya's fault. I've got the weather this time. Fanya's fault.
Can you see that there's no
Fanya's fault.
So we're not sure where in the record.
So I just confirm it. That is the case. This witness is in fact just going to give background evidence regarding the situation in Cradock, Eastern Cape, that led to the death of the late Cradock Four.
And how can I identify the file that you've just handed up as a file concerning what?
My lady, it's the TRC amnesty evidence of Professor Derek Swartz that was led on the 3rd of June 1998. It's given on the 3rd of June 1998. Thank you. Professor Swartz, if we can just continue. We can just look at page 9. We are at page 19.
Yes.
You see there the late Advocate Bezos was leading. And there you confirmed at the bottom that you were presently at a university professor at the University of Fordham.
Correct, sir.
And you then also confirmed that you had a PhD degree in industrial psychology. Yes. And then he took you through what position you had occupied with the UDF at the time, the United Democratic Front. Can you please just tell us?
Yeah. At the time when we formed the UDF in 1983, and we then, after the formation of the UDF nationally, we set up the Eastern Cape structures, and it sort of broadly coincided with the political geography, if you like, of the division of the country into provinces under the old apartheid system. So there was a border, as
Yes.
you may recall, or some of you may recall, border region, and of course an Eastern Cape region and a Western Cape region. So we constituted this as a region in 1983, almost immediately after the national founding conference in Mitchell's Plain in Cape Town. I think it was in August 1983. And I became part of the leadership of that as a General Secretary for the Eastern Cape, and ipso facto became then also a member of the National Executive Committee of the UDF, which was composed of all the provinces or the regions, let me put it this way, that made up the national umbrella. This is a rapidly evolving umbrella organization, a front. And the French word frente literally means a frontier, that holds and aligns and directs the energies of whatever constituent forces make up the front itself. So it's a very different kind of organization from let's say an NGO or a company and so on. It was an umbrella body that reflected, in fact, the constituent elements of that. And so I was a General Secretary, and then also I think I was part of the National Secretariat, if I recall correctly, and the NEC, of course, as well. Yes. And the late Comrade Matthew Gqeberha was recruited as our rural organizer almost shortly after that, because the Eastern Cape, as you know, has two sort of like urban centers. It is London, Buffalo City now, and Port Elizabeth, Gqeberha, and a vast hinterland. And a significant segment of our population is located outside of these urban areas. And so we wanted to organize the peri-urban and the rural areas, and of course, and we could think of no better person than the late Comrade Matthew Gqeberha, Fort Calata, and many others that then worked to help us to constitute, if you like, the regional centers or the rural regional centers of the UDF here.
Yes, thank you. Then, if we can just, my lady, we are on page 20 of the bundle. In the middle of the page, Mr. Bezos asks you the following question. He says, Now, in view of what this committee has heard from a number of policemen in the security police who apparently equated UDF activities with terrorism, I want you to please tell the committee what the UDF stood for, what its policies were and how it wanted to achieve them, and whether violence against persons or so-called what the authorities call terrorism was any part of its policy. Please give us a short overview of these matters, Professor Swartz. Now, you then set out in your response there. Can you read that into the record for us, please?
Read or
Yeah,
talk
you
to
can
it?
explain.
All right. Well, as I recall, and I just had a quick look at, cursory look at this as you were talking earlier. You know, the UDF was principally a non-racial,
Yes.
democratic, non-sexist organization, a front to create an alternative to the apartheid thesis, the theory of how a society should be constituted in the social and political imagination of apartheid. We wanted to contrast ourselves to say apartheid divides, UDF unites, and we enumerated a set of principles. One of them is indeed a peaceful resistance, but militant resistance, but within the law. And so, as I said at the time to the late Advocate Bezos, that the term terrorism, of course, is usually the scourge of someone who's run out of arguments. You know, so then it becomes a label, so the rubric that you throw it without any analytical, you know, meaning whatsoever. And we, of course, rejected that at all, completely. And you may recall that we were not the first peaceful organization, peaceful but militant organization in the history of struggle of our country. The UDF was itself a successive movement in a series of cumulative, you know, movements that emerged at different periods of the history of struggle, from the time of colonialism right up to the contemporary period in which, of course, I was active in with some of my comrades. And the ANC itself, the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, the South African Communist Party, were all peaceful organizations, but became more militant because the system of apartheid at the time, and before that the colonial system, proved to be impervious to change, to real fundamental change, to cede to the demands for a democratic order. And it then, like in the 1950s, leading up to the 1960s, it led to the repression and eventually the complete outright banning of liberation movements. Now, the same sequel, not quite exactly the same, happened with the UDF also in the 80s. And there are sort of three periods I can think of, and I haven't reconstructed that history you know, in any sort of detailed way, but if I can just briefly, I can think about three periods in which one can periodize the history of the UDF. It was the early period from 1983 till about the state of emergency, 1985. And that was the period in which the organization was, you know, set up and militated and campaigned. And it was an extraordinary period of mushrooming of resistance, popular resistance, and in all areas from cultural movements to youth organizations to music societies, to the churches were right at the forefront of this as well. Cultural movements, you know, through poetry, people expressed the fact that, I mean, this has got to end. It's an absurdity of human history that you have a system based on racial exclusivity, and that something has to be done to change it. So it led to a mushrooming of popular aspirations for a clamor for a new South Africa, so to speak, beautifully expressed in songs, in poetry, in mass mobilization, and so on, in all areas. I was involved in church youth movements at the time. I was a teacher, of course. I spoke at churches, youth camps, and it was an amazing period in fact, people saying, we want to shut down this chapter in our tragic history as a nation, and we want to imagine a new future. And so it's in that context then that the UDF then played an important role, especially in that period up to the state of emergency. And then, of course, the regime struck 2 states of emergency, as the court may know well from history. And it effectively suppressed the organization and drove it semi-underground to a point of almost near dismantling. And that was a second period of what I would probably characterize as the UDF under repression. Mark could put a variety of different ways of putting that. And so until the end of the second state of emergency, a climate of fear of repression, and of course that period, I would argue, was inaugurated by the murder, the assassination of the 4 comrades, together with others as well. I mean, of course, I think in '86 in May, the so-called PEPCO 3, Sipho Hashe, Kodolozi, Comrade Hashe Kodolozi, and Champion Galela were also murdered. So we were aware at the time of that. It was very difficult times for us to operate, very dangerous times for life and limb, and in fact it was quite terrifying often to see the extent to which the regime had gone in political suppression, not only using the state apparatus, but also what I call the privatization of terror, that they literally, farmed out this to private groups, that the mercenaries literally, that then were involved in all sorts of heinous acts that I cannot, enumerate. So that was the second phase. And then the third phase, I would say, is post when the banning order on the UDF was lifted, or the draconian repression was lifted. From that period until Nelson Mandela left, prison, and our society opened up. And I think that UDF played a crucial role in all the 3 phases, and particularly the last one that led to the decline, and then eventually the collapse of the old order, and then of course creating a peaceful, relatively peaceful transition to democracy. Had it not been for that a peaceful nature of the UDF, our country would have been in flames, absolutely. And there was a core philosophical debate and a set of principles that we enunciated right from the beginning, that we cannot possibly construct a democratic order when we violate the very same principles that we want to uphold in a new future.
Thank you. So, to just come back to Advocate Bezos' question, would I be correct then to say that you couldn't have regarded the Cradock Four as terrorists?
No, it's absolute. Sorry to use the word nonsense. I mean, it's totally.
Yes.
It was a scurrilous libel,
yes,
and it had no basis in fact,
yes,
in history. So I regard them as absolute heroes. They were and they are, I guess, the seedlings of democracy.
yes.
And in a macabre way, it took their lives to, in the end, bring down the apartheid system, because the reaction was, the revulsion against this most heinous of crimes was just so absolutely outraged that not even the slightest bit of shred of legitimacy that the regime was hanging on about apartheid as a noble social order, it could cling on. It lost all legitimacy. And it also lost all sense of legality, because it was breaking even its own legal codes written up in the then constitution by committing a murder and assassination through state machinery as well. So, as I say, in a bitter sort of way, that the price that that these four comrades paid, and their families, whom I really want to also pay my respects to, laid the foundations and created this avalanche towards what we now enjoy as a relatively peaceful democratic order.
And what role did the issue regarding the tri-cameral parliament, the elections for the tri-cameral parliament, what role did that play in the mobilization of the people?
In my view, by the end of the 1970s, after the 1976 uprisings, the apartheid state was grappling with the idea of how to stabilize what has been a build-up of frustrations between 1960 and 1970, that period when our late state president Madiba and others were imprisoned, and the ANC and other movements were exiled and so on. There was what typically but falsely called a vacuum. It wasn't really a vacuum. But during that period, the precedence of a new sort of resurgence of a movement built up. In 1973, the independent trade union movement started with the dock workers' strike in Durban, as some of you may recall, or at least have a sense of history. In 1976, there was this absolute outburst, started in Soweto and then spiraled throughout the country. And although that did not lead to a national movement in the same way as the UDF did in the later period, it laid the foundations for the subsequent emergence of the organizations, on the basis of which the UDF then graduated to become this umbrella organization in the 80s as well. And so at the time, the regime was also in its own calculus. It was obviously having to save apartheid, and it did all sorts of things, which we studied at the time very carefully as well. One of the machinations of the regime then was to invent this system that they called three chambers of parliament, if you like, that racially segmented, that took on or represented ostensibly white people, colored people, and then Indian people, but excluded the African majority. And of course, it was an absolute farce at the time. And it was going to be unworkable because it excluded more than 80% of the population of the country. But it was part of an attempt, of a series of attempts, but this is the latest attempt by the government of the then P.W. Botha to adapt the apartheid system to cope with its internal contradictions. The contradictions were becoming so clear and palpable and unmanageable, but it was a desperate attempt to buy off a section of the black population and thereby stymie the conditions for resistance and so on. So we campaigned against this because it's an undemocratic decision. Just think about it in today's term. I'm sure the current generation will think back when they read that history as absolutely absurd, because it was on intellectual, on material grounds, on ethical grounds, absolutely unsound and unworkable. But it was an effort by them to force this upon the black population. So we used that at the time to campaign, to say no. We had a 1 million signature campaign, for example. We worked in the streets and house to house. We collected signatures of people, and then through that we conscientized the population. And many of my comrades may recall those campaigns. And effectively we then prevented the regime from imposing this with any degree of legitimacy as well, which is of course why when it ran out of options, I guess, it started calculating using more repressive, extra-legal forms of repression of the opposition as well. Yeah.
And I remember this inquest is in fact an investigation into the deaths of these comrades. And can you just tell the court, how did you come to know them?
I guess we met each other in the cauldrons of the struggle, you know. I can't recall when, to be honest. You know, the mass democratic movement was an extraordinary journey of discovery. And we just met in different corners because we sought each other out, and you know, it was conditions that hard to describe now, thinking back about how normal things are in society today. Like most literature on transformation, on revolution, on change, you know, democratic change, were banned in the country. We couldn't show a photograph of Madiba. Think about it, the absurdity of today. We had to smuggle literature. It's not guns, it's literature, just reading matter, but it was seen, of course, as absolute taboo. And so I met Comrade Fort Calata and Matthew Goni, where I think in the early 1980s. In the early 1980s, I think Matthew had come back from prison. He was in a long period of incarcerated, and really they badly damaged him, tortured him, as he told me this as well. Fort Calata comes from a legendary family, as you may know, with a noble history in struggle dating back to the 1920s and so on. So of course I knew about them at the time. So I can't exactly tell you when we met, but we met in the struggle, let me put it this way, an organization, and Matthew stayed with me often on occasion, and at night we used to debate things about a future society. I remember those conversations very well. When we started speculating and theorizing about a democratic, some of the elements that are in our constitution now, we debated then when last did I see him, and so on. And then, of course, I explained exactly what I said now. And then they were making calls to hospitals and police stations, because we thought at the time we were obviously, I suppose it's a human thing that you console yourself with the idea that they are arrested. And so you immediate places would be calling police stations. Lukhanyo at the time was a police station, hospitals and so on. Yeah.
Yes. Professor Swartz, can I then just ask you, do you confirm these three statements, the contents, the correctness thereof, that I've shown you? That is, the statement marked A113 and in the statement marked A71 and A65. Do you confirm the correctness?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
And do you also confirm the correctness of your oral testimony that you gave at the TRCM's hearing?
Yes, sir.
That I've
Just so that you're aware, myself and my friend represent the Cradock Four families. We just have a few questions by way of follow-up for you. First, on behalf of the families, I'd like to thank you for your contribution to the struggle for liberation and the role that you play in relation to their families. You've given some very helpful context. And I wonder if you can just elaborate on one aspect. It appears to many of us that the Eastern Cape became something of the epicenter of resistance to apartheid. Are there any peculiar reasons why this region, more than others, was so vigorous in their actions against the apartheid regime?
That is a question. Rural centers in relative deprivation, social deprivation, in dormitory towns that had very little industry around them, so the levels of industrialization outside of the cities were, in a sense, much less developed, let me put it this way, than in the major centers like in the Vaal Triangle, as we used to call it, in Gauteng, and in Cape Town and in Durban as well, which are the major industrial centers as well. And there was a large degree of migration from rural areas when the reserve economies or the homeland economies were battling to create the conditions of existence. There was a large afflux of people into these peri-urban dormitory towns in the 1970s and 80s as the restrictions on movement started to become more relaxed, so to speak. There was still influx control and so on. So these populations just mushroomed, but the regime could not create the conditions for the social reproduction of the support of those communities because industries were not, rural industries did not develop, the farms did not absorb large enough labor. So I suspect that the political economy of significant parts of that, I need to think about this a bit more carefully, because you're asking, a question that I should be reflecting on. So certainly I think the socioeconomic realities, certainly imposed a set of conditions of deprivation on those communities, and the lack and failure for the provision of social services like electricity and water, proper, sewerage systems and so on. These towns still look, I remember very well when I went to Lingalihle and Cookhouse and these places, these particularly black African townships, was reminiscent of the 1950s and 60s, whereas then the urban areas that had moved further, the regime had succeeded in providing basic services in many of the urban townships, relatively more developed than that in the peri-urban and certainly in the rural areas as well. Combined with that is that the ANC has long had and the liberation movements for that matter, even the PAC, deep roots going right back to the 1910s and 20s in the Eastern Cape. The legendary Canon Calata, who was Port's, grandfather, was a leading figure in the Eastern Cape, and the churches in the Eastern Cape played an important role in the evolution and of the promotion of the struggle and so on. So there was a deep history of struggle, and many of the legendary leaders that were banished and came to Robben Island and exile and so on came from the Eastern Cape as well. Of course, our late state president Mandela, Oliver Tambo, many of them, Governor Mbeki and so on, heralded came from these conditions, and so they could trace back their roots. This is not a lost population, and the same population too can trace its roots even back to the anti-colonial struggles of hundreds of years, the frontier wars as well. There was a history of resistance in the so-called frontier wars, between African communities being pushed back from their lands by settler communities moving in. There's a rich tapestry of history sketching out that, culture of resistance, if you like. So I would suggest, it might not be a academic way of putting a coherent way of putting it, a combination of political economy reasons and to do with the history of struggle that fomented this sort of like culture of resistance, and that attracted a level of suppression or repression that was probably distinctive in the Eastern Cape. But there are other parts of the country, of course, where that also was quite ferocious, like in KwaZulu-Natal, for example, and in some of the northern provinces as well.
Thank you, Professor. That's really useful background and context. And turning to the town of Cradock and Lingalihle itself, when one thinks of Cradock and the history of South Africa, one thinks of a town that symbolizes the fight against the apartheid system. Can you offer any thoughts as to why that town in particular has become so emblematic of the resistance to apartheid?
Yeah, that's also another enigmatic question, why it became so emblematic of the resistance. I guess because of the level of social mobilization that was achieved by the Cradock community, that very rarely, if I recall from that period, now and I may be wrong about some other areas, had we achieved such almost a total shutdown of the community, refusing to collaborate with the apartheid system, literally shutting the community up to say, but we are not accepting you governing our lives. And with Matthew and others, we theorized a lot about what the significance of that moment in conjuncture would signal, because it was the first township in the country in the early part of the 1980s. There was total mobilization of the township community that refused the imposition of what they then called the black local authorities. These were dummy local authorities that the apartheid system tried to impose on them. Complete rejection. All the councillors resigned and returned to the community. And the regime did not know how to deal with this unusual situation where you literally have an autonomous zone, almost like in Spain during the Spanish Civil Wars. Some of you may recall that you had these autonomous cities and towns emerging when they were fighting against Francisco Franco, the dictator at the time, and so on. Or in Italy, during the time of Mussolini, for example, there were also these autonomous zones emerging, but in the context of a vastly repressive system, encroaching upon that as well. So I would say that it's to do with the extraordinary role that these leaders had played. All four of them and many others, some of them are here, as I said, Mulelo Doniwe and others had played a role in that regard. And so the regime, I think, was bent on crushing that because it was I suspect they saw it as a seed of a threatening, specter of an alternative legal and socio-political system emerging in the womb of the apartheid system. And it could not be tolerated. It had to be strangulated, so to speak. And they had to remove the leaders that they saw as instrumental in having created these conditions. But these conditions were objectively created by history, as far as I'm concerned.
And, would you agree that this leadership, the Cradock Four themselves and others, the regime could actually see them extracting concessions and making gains? For example, mass mobilization against rentals and getting those rentals reduced. 15 months of school boycotts, consumer boycotts, which seem to be incredibly effective against white businesses. They saw that and that worried them.
Moreover, I think it worried them not so much about Lingelite and Cradock itself, but rather what it represents as a spectre, a threat to the authoritarian project, so to speak. And remember, this is popping out all over, not to the same extent. So I remember when I went to the Western Cape to speak to colleagues there, my comrades in the Western Cape, because I was General Secretary, they were very curious at the time to know, how are you guys doing this? Able to turn the instruments of the apartheid system. The township is an instrument, of course, it's a settlement, into something that works against its interests so successfully. And I was at pains to sketch out to them at the time. I remember that these experiments can only work if they mushroom and if they can expand the economies of scale. And if they find a way to fortify and to protect them, to secure them against regime repression. But as long as the conditions of struggle are uneven across the society, we stand the risk of us being isolated and then, of course, being dumbed down as well. So that was a debate. I do remember that very well.
And on that score, you've been referred to the so-called G plan or the Gqeberha plan, where street committees, area committees, township committees were being established. And from what I understand, as you say, those are replicated through the region. When Gqeberha became first the rural organizer and then later the UDF organizer for that region, that those were replicated through most communities, around 54 communities around the region. That must have posed a considerable threat to the regime.
I would imagine so. If I were in their shoes and thinking about political calculus, about how I maintain my own regime strategies, then of course, yeah, they would have been. And they had this elaborate system, national management security system, I think it was called at the time, JMCs and so on, where military and political leaders had fused together to create holistic responses to what they considered to be a generalized revolt, an insurrection against them, because the fires were just, proverbial fires were just going up all over the show in the early to the mid-1980s. So they erected the superstructure in a way to both crew surveillance, but also to coordinate actions to suppress and divide and harass, and all sorts of tactics to unscramble what we were attempting as well. So it was literally a war of maneuvers, as Antonio Gramsci calls it, as well, between us and them. And I would imagine that the idea of organizing alternative forms of political and social neighborhood-based organizations, like what we call now, you refer to as a G plan, constituted a novel threat to the regime's plans to impose the black local authority system, which they wanted to impose on African communities. And then they have other versions for the colored and Indian communities, also the colored management committees, the Indian management committees, also similar puppet structures. They were all collapsing. And so the regime didn't have the ability then to extract the resources and to be able to govern those areas as well. So for me, I think, I may be wrong, it was a symptom of a larger worry on their side that it might paralyze the ability to govern across the system.
And so turning to the possible motivation for these murders, my learned friend from the state referred you to an exchange from the TRC amnesty proceedings between yourself and Advocate Bezos. And you were pointed to sections where Gqeberha and others had been referred to as terrorists, and you explained that they weren't terrorists, but they were mobilizing in their communities. Would you agree that given their ability to carry out the structural organization, not just in the Cradock vicinity, but throughout the region, their ability to bring tens of thousands of people out into the streets quite quickly, that in fact posed the greatest threat to the regime, and ultimately explained why a decision was taken to eliminate them?
I would concur with that hypothesis. I would certainly have the same view, that because they were organizing a vast rural hinterland up to Colesberg, I think, Cookhouse, all those rural places, even Noupoort, I remember Gravrinet as well, which was bordering into what then was called the Western Cape. It's still now the Western Cape, I guess. The Karoo areas that they were organizing. And we just found that the skill, the acumen of that unit of ours, led by Comrade Gqeberha, was just so genial and so creative with so little resources. I remember I always felt guilty that we didn't have enough resources to be able to support them from our side. Because remember, these were voluntary organizations. We didn't have revenue sources other than what we collected from organizations. We got some international philanthropic donors to support us with some churches, of course, gave their venues to us, mosques and so on. It was really literally on a bootstring, we were carrying out this. And I was struck, I have to say, and I think I wrote about this also at some stage, at the ingenuity of them to be able to spiral and radiate into those rural communities. And I think that constituted the threat of radiation, of becoming a domino effect on the rest of the social structure. Probably was they then realized that this thing is, before this thing becomes worse, they have to do something about this. I would speculate that would be the motive here.
Right. And in your evidence in chief, you alluded to the fact that the state was running out of options. They had attempted to employ all the legal arsenal at their disposal. All the four had been detained on several occasions. They were restricted. They couldn't be quoted, at least some of them. And indeed, Matthew Gqeberha himself, and he did have links to the underground movement at the time. There is evidence to that effect. And indeed, he had set up, while working in the Transkei, an underground cell, Marxist cell as it was described, and he was charged under the Communism Act and went to jail for some nearly 5 years. So where they could take action against them, they did.
You do confirm that, Professor? You do confirm that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
I had conversations with him about this, yeah.
Yeah. So where the state could take action against them, they did. Clearly, they were unable to put further cases against Matthew Gqeberha and the Four. The detentions were not having the desired effect. So, as you mentioned, at least from their perspective, they had to move to the extra-legal option. And in their view, would you agree that the only option available to them was to silence them forever?
Well, I'm not sure about the latter part of your statement, whether that was the only option available for them. They could have just had long-term incarceration. There were instruments for that. They could do banning orders. They were not under banning orders then. So there were other legal options available to the regime. Killing them was a decision that requires its own sort of explanation. It certainly was not on the grounds that there were other options that were unavailable, in my humble opinion. They were frustrated that those instruments that they used before did not have the effect of shutting them down. But under Section 189, I think it was called, Terrorism Act, they could detain you for up to 18 months and in solitary confinement, and they could really do damage to you doing that. They can literally take you out with those other instruments. So my reasoning is that I don't think that they may have opted for this radical, drastic option, but it wasn't, in my view, because objectively speaking, other options were not available. I think they made a calculation based on some instructions that they got, that this was the, or at least how they interpreted what the instruction was. That's my sort of like hypothesis. Obviously not in the shoes of those individuals, so I can't explicitly say what their calculations were. Yeah.
No, sure. And of course, I don't want to take into the realm of speculation. Although I do agree with you that elimination wasn't the only option to neutralize them. As you mentioned, they could have been placed under banning orders or simply repeated detentions.
Yeah.
But would you agree that from their perspective, those measures were counterproductive because, and the documents do disclose this, every time they took these draconian actions, there was a public outcry, locally and internationally, and they didn't like that. Is that your recollection?
I agree. They made a political calculus based on what they deemed to be the best path forward. But yeah, as I say, that it was probably a function of the desperation under which they were functioning at the time that they resorted to that as well. But even that option too became then such an egregious act of international outcry, and it triggered then the demise of the regime rapidly from 1985 until the end of the 1980s. That led to the transition to democracy. So I suppose if you look at it in hindsight, it was a huge miscalculation from their part. But whether that's the calculation, I would agree with you.
And there's certainly some irony in that outcome.
Precisely.
Because it precipitated quite the opposite they were looking for.
Precisely.
Just a few other matters, Professor Swartz. You mentioned that you had occasion to read tapped conversation transcripts between yourself and Mr. Gqeberha. Are those transcripts still available?
I think so. I was looking for them last night. I was actually trying to remember them because I remember the conversation when I read it. I was struck at how they recorded the cryptic exchange between myself and the late Matthew Gqeberha. But I'm sure the prosecuting authorities, they have all that information. I definitely read the transcript of our conversation.
We'll check the record. And
Yeah.
If it's not in there, then we might come back to you. You mentioned an incident that took place at court chambers in Port Elizabeth where you nearly got killed. Can you just explain to the court what happened at those chambers?
Yeah. We had convened one of our regional executive committee meetings. I think it was in months, or perhaps even weeks before the abduction and the murder of these comrades. And I was with the president, Edgar Ngoyi, Comrade Henry Fazi, Stone Sizani, Prince Msutu. I think Roland White was also there at the meeting. He might not have been there at the time. And I don't recall Comrade Matthew being at that meeting. And already at that time there was a repressive environment around. And I distinctly remember I asked one of my comrades there, Tango Lamani, who was an activist in the UDF at the time, to keep a watch on the outside, because it was a very open facility in the middle of North End, Port Elizabeth. Some of you know the urban centre there, so quite vulnerable to isolate at night. And for some reason he left to the shop, and during that time these characters came in. They were hooded and they had all sorts of weapons, and it was quite terrifying. They were wanting to do us harm, let me put it this way. And they were making threatening utterances to the late Comrade Henry Fazi, who was the vice president of the UDF at the time, accusing him of all sorts of things as well. And fortunately, the way the vice president handled it with such calm, and it was really terrifying. I remember at the time, because they were literally wanting to do us grievous physical harm. Let me put it this way. I don't know where it would have ended as well. And the building was completely at burglar guards, and we were on the top floor of the building. You were literally trapped in there, these bulky fellows, behind us and so on. And then I really admired the courage and the wisdom of these Robben Islanders. I remember this old man, late Henry Fazi, spent 23 years on the island. Also, Edgar Ngoyi was there, also I think 26 years on Robben Island, and all of them. And the wisdom, they didn't panic, and they calmed down the situation, and these guys just moved out as well. So, of course, after that event, we assessed our situation, that we were going to have to be now extremely careful and vigilant, and figure a way out how to operate, but also be cautious enough to be able to survive limb and life.
Yeah. And these armed men with their heads covered, they didn't disclose whether they were security branch or where they were from?
No, the leader wasn't didn't have balaclava on and so on. So we know who it was at the time. And so, no, not all of them were in disguise.
I see. So they were from Port Elizabeth Security Branch?
No, they were what I earlier referred to as the privatization of terror, right, where you had civil groups that were armed, paramilitary groups that were armed and instigated to augment the security forces, to extend us, harass us, do all sorts of things as well. There are various of these groups that were formed during that time. They're given all sorts of names, of course, as well. They orchestrated political groups. Political might be a wrong name to call them, but they were paramilitary groups. Yeah.
Vigilante group?
Vigilantes, are right term.
Can I ask you to name the leader of that group?
Yeah, it was Reverend Martina.
I see. if we can now turn to your evidence in chief in relation to the meeting that took place on the 27th of June 1985. Now, you mentioned these were the days where no internet, WhatsApp, cell phones, things were done pretty the old-fashioned way. So you had to have these meetings. Am I correct in saying that these meetings happened on a fairly regular basis? And if so, how often?
Yes, I can't exactly recall, Your Worship, on the regularity of it. I mean, the frequency, how many times, but we would certainly every 2 weeks we'll probably be meeting. I didn't keep records because records were also used against us, and so the written memory of that period is past, if you can put it this way, because we were operating under cloak and dagger often, and the deliberations we had to often keep confidential, if not secret, because otherwise our plans would be revealed by the regime, and so on. So I would suggest probably once every 2 weeks we met, depending on the conditions. And remember, these are vast distances that you have to travel to come, to bring them together. I mean, we also had Gqeberha Quinty to come to us. He was also a rural organizer in the Albany region. He lived in Grahamstown. It was a difficult and dangerous times to move around, if you can see what I'm suggesting. So we kept it conservative, but we had to meet, otherwise you cannot function as an organization. That's why.
And who was typically in the team from Cradock who would come to these meetings every second week or so?
I would suggest it, apart from Matthew Gqeberha, Fort would come sometimes. I would also have discussions with him. Mulelo Gqeberha, who's Bishop Gqeberha, who's here, was a activist during that time, a leading figure as well on the youth side as well, because we were looking at different strategies and networks to organize and to figure out how we're going to do things. So this is a period of the political discovery, if you like. So I think those would be the sort of people that I typically would have interacted, you know.
Mr. Fort Calata as well?
Yeah.
And did you know who was coming that particular week?
No, except for Matthew, no. I didn't know. He normally didn't drive himself for some curious reason. I always used to ask him this, why don't you drive? And he said, no, I think I'm more comfortable with sitting in the back. He was a very calm, gentle person, you know, so he wasn't sort of like on the forefront. So he never drove himself, but I assumed that he would have someone to drive, but I didn't ask because, remember, we were talking on the phone. You kept things to the minimum, you know.
Well, we'll hear from the family members, but my understanding was that although he could drive, he didn't actually have a driver's license, at least a physical one.
Okay.
And he didn't want to be stopped.
Oh.
But we'll hear from the family members in that regard.
He never told me that, by the way.
You mentioned in your evidence this morning that just before he left, I suppose this would have been around 9 p.m. in the evening at Michael Kutsia's house, that you did plead with him that he should perhaps stay because it was late at night and there were risks. And if I understood correctly, if I remember correctly, you said that he wanted to get back to his family. He had family matters to attend to. What did that say about Matthew the man, that late at night, notwithstanding the risks, he really wanted to return?
Yeah. As I said earlier on, I knew him as a very gentle person, very considerate. And I remember once we were sleeping together, you know, in the same room at a house that I had access to during that period. And we spoke the whole night till the early hours of the morning because we were really enamored with understanding where this journey that is going to take us to. We were speculating about the future. So he loved reading, and I loved reading as well. And then we would compare notes about things, and he would say, "What do you think of this?" And I would say, "What do you think of that?" And then suddenly he would let his book go, and he says, "You know, Comrade Derek, I really love my wife." Yeah.
Thank you. Professor, thanks so much for giving your time, and we wish you well on your long flight that you're about to take.
Thank you, sir.
No further questions. No?
Keeping it with the families, Mr. Ngwetobi.
My lady,
Family
it's
representatives.
11:40, so I don't know whether your lady
If you don't mind
is still
saying,
strong enough to carry on.
strong as ever.
So shall I continue? Or?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Unless there's someone who has a very pressing need to take a break, maybe a comfort break, let's carry on. Because that will also entail another long delay, reconvening and all that. If you don't mind, let's carry on.
Let's ask
I
Mr.
don't
Madolo
mind.
if he wants a break. Professor Swartz, just one matter of detail I'm interested in. So on the 27th of June 1985, you then had a conversation with Mr. Goniwe, and you said to them they should not stop on the way except if they are stopped by the police.
Or security, traffic officers.
Or traffic officers, yes. Now, the statement that was given by Gert Lotz, who was an applicant for amnesty in the TRC, is interesting because it coincides with that. So in the TRC, he said the following about the 27th of June 1985. It says, by 11 p.m., the vehicle, a beige Honda Palade, with the 4 occupants, arrived from the direction of Port Elizabeth. We followed them for a while, after which Lieutenant Taylor and I overtook the vehicle, and with the assistance of the blue police light, pulled the vehicle off the road. Captain Van Zyl stopped behind this vehicle. We then informed the persons to accompany us as we were arresting them. That is also confirmed in another statement by Taylor himself, also applying for amnesty, where he says, at approximately 11 p.m., we observed this vehicle, and now they're talking about the Matthews car, and it had passed us in the direction of Cradock. It was a beige-colored Honda Palade with 4 occupants. We followed this vehicle up to a point where there was no other visible traffic, whereupon Sergeant Lotz and I, with the assistance of a blue light,
No, my house was certainly parked, but we
Yes.
didn't have the conversation in my house.
yes, but how?
I leaned into the car before they were leaving, and unless the car was parked,
Yes,
of course. I mean, I don't know.
yes,
But that was a one-to-one conversation that I had with him.
yes.
Yeah.
The other thing I wondered about is the actual nature of the murder is a gruesome murder, and there are some accounts in the record that say the murder was intended to be a disguise. It was intended to look like it was not an official police murder, but a murder by thugs. But at the same time, when they stopped them, they were, in an official capacity, stopping them as police. And I couldn't reconcile the two. I wonder if you can help me there.
I don't know whether my interpretation is a correct one, of
Yes.
course, so I'm saying this from my own point of view. I think the use of the legal means to stop them, to intercept them, was what it is.
Yes.
It is an effective way to stop them because if you pulled off by a blue light, you stop.
Yes.
That's the instinct of everyone then and now. But they then must have done it in an area that was so secluded and there were no traffic or people observing, as far as I would imagine, that they then used the arresting of these 4 individuals then as a way to get them in an illegal operation, literally, to assassinate them, to murder them, and to do all these things. So maybe the one was just a way to intercept them.
Yes.
But the real intent was that they have to murder them.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the only explanation I can get out.
Yes.
But I definitely know that we would not have spoken about that on the phone, because in the transcript you'll actually see verbatimly we spoke about that. Is very cryptic about the meeting itself. I distinctly remember I leaned into the car and I said, "Bro, don't you want to rather stay over, given what is happening," and so on. So, but the car could have been bugged.
Yes.
I mean, they had the ability then to track cars and so on. Those technologies were available.
Yes. Yeah. But yes, you don't remember whether the transcript you were referring to came from the bugging of your house or the bugging of Matthew's house.
No, we don't know that. We're unable to tell when. It's just the NPA should be able to get that. That's the police.
Yes.
They're recording. So either Comrade Matthew's house. So I know my house was bugged because it was petrol bombed and all sorts of things were done to my place. That I know. And he knew his house was also bugged as well. But where the bug, how it works, to be honest, I don't know.
Yes. And then there's also just something interesting here. In Winter's affidavit, he explains the so-called political motive. He says, "I was informed that this operation," now that's the operation for the basically execution or assassination of the Cradock Four.
Were you reading from Mr.
It is the translated statements from the TRC. It's at page 38, my lady. I think we got this from Mr. Vane's clients. From CDH. Well, from Mr. Vane's attorneys.
You can carry on.
Yes. So I'm now at page 38 of the translations. So I just want to give you a chance to expand on the answer you gave to Mr. Vane around the political objects, because Mr. Winter said at page 38, "I was informed that this operation was related to the fact that these activists were identified as persons who posed a threat to the government and political order, since their activities could not be controlled by normal policing and judicial application of laws of the country anymore at that stage. I was subsequently informed that the elimination of these persons would assist in preventing the riotous activities and that the organizing of unrest and anarchy by these activists would be restrained." So what's interesting here is that what the killers were told was that we cannot use the law anymore. The only way is to be an outlaw. And that's crucial for me, because I want to understand what kind of people these were, what kind of a person Matthew Gqeberha was, what kind of a person Fort Calata was. Were they people predisposed to violent means of protest, or were they predisposed to peaceful means of resistance?
Well, I can reframe what I said earlier, in addressing this issue. Far from it. The entire raison d'etre of the democratic movement called the UDF during that time was based on peaceful struggle, but militant struggle. Because once you become violent, you then trigger a set of responses. You pick up arms, for example, then you will trigger a set of responses from the regime. That happened with the liberation movements prior to 1960, before they were banned. So we obviously were not unaware of the fact that the regime would use violence, to suppress non-violent like they did before. But we wanted to have enough time in that early period. From 1980, we began sort of theorizing about the theory of change, or how we're going to bring this about. As we wanted to, unlike before in the 1950s, we wanted a deeper penetration of the new communities formed under the 1960 period. You know, was this boom in the economy, as I explained earlier on to senior counsel, a proliferation of new townships, new communities, new identities, new cultures, new institutions, and so on. So we wanted to reach into those institutions as far as we can to build a multi-layer network of solidaristic communities up, so that when the moment comes when the regime really pulls out extra legal force, then we would be more robust to resist the suppression. That was the sort of thinking at the time as we were debating this. So Matthew and Fort Calata, Sperm Conte, Sicelo Matlauli, we were all part of that non-violent movement, militant but non-violent as well, because we had to push the boundaries of protest, but within the law. And the idea was that we did not want to alienate our own communities too, because, I mean, why would our community mothers and fathers support a group of anarchists or people that use force, you know, as a political instrument, if you can see what I mean, as a matter of policy anyway. So the raison d'etre of the democratic movement was predicated on the notion of militant, non-violent resistance and building because conscientization, we were reading Paulo Freire at the time, he was a Brazilian educational theorist, spoke about this. You can't produce that by force, you know. Umkhabulo is a word that we use in language in our political culture. It's about political dialogue, persuading people. We spent countless days and hours persuading people about a democratic alternative to the authoritarian regime that we had, you know, two different completely universes or cultures, so to speak, as well. So the notion that Gqeberha and his comrades were violent is a complete historical, it's nonsense. It has no basis in fact as well. Even the Marxists say Marxism is a theory of change. It's an ideology of change. There's nothing violent about Marxism per se. We debated all those concepts and ideas during that time. And in none of those conversations did we ever enter into a conversation about the UDF becoming armed at the time. It's just not historically based on any fact as well. So your question is about whether the thesis or the theory that they operated under is because these comrades were violent.
Yes, well, you see, the statement here, it goes further. It says that their elimination, in other words, the killing of the Cradock Four, would further also contribute to the reduction of damage to property and loss of life within the current unrest situation in especially black townships. So what they seem to have done is they told the killers that we have these dangerous people who have to be eliminated in order to return peace and stability in the black townships.
Yeah. No, I, like I said earlier on, I think the fact that they resorted to that option was because of the way their political calculation worked.
Yes.
Not because there were no other options available. There were other legal options available to neutralize or at least frustrate or slow down the process of mobilization. But they, in their political calculation, that's what they and remember, the regime was founded on violence. The whole idea of apartheid and colonialism, for that matter, is a violent system. It cannot work only on the basis of persuasion, because how would you be able to persuade the majority of people to forsake their claim to democratic rights? You know, it's just not a rational proposition. You have to resort to violence as a means. And I think that was sort of part of the DNA of the regime at the time, that let's do the worst and see where it takes us to. Of course, as the senior counsel said, the irony of it all is it actually led to the collapse of the regime.
Now, obviously there was an element of trying to instill terror and fear because of the nature of the killing. These people were stabbed several times, and then their bodies were then set alight. And when they were discovered, some of them were partially disfigured. So it's a particularly gruesome form of killing. What was the impact of that form of the killing, this particularly vicious and gruesome form of killing? What impact did that have on the UDF?
Look, I want to take away the personal pain of this because I think the question is more at a sociological level about the UDF itself. It sent shudders through the movement. It was a terrible, and you may recall the reaction of the anger, not just nationally but globally against this event, had led to, after the funeral, at the funeral, PW Botha then announced a state of emergency. You may recall that. We were still in Lingalihle at the funeral when they were blocking the roads and arresting activists as they were coming back. I mean, I remember I had to also find ways to drive through all sorts of farmlands and so on to avoid arrest. And I immediately went into the underground, as did many of my other comrades, in the aftermath of the funeral. Immediately, in fact, they were announcing it on radio. We heard through our own sources that they were going to, or they were debating to announce it, but we were not so sure. And then I remember, I think it's Trevor Manuel or someone, told us also that they now just heard on the radio. They were all in Cradock at the time. And so the violent nature of this act, the barbaric nature of this act, sent shudders through and there was a huge debate inside the democratic movement. Is this the beginning of a new period in which that would become the norm, the stock response? In other words, that it would no longer use the normal, usual legal ways to frustrate us, that they will now pull out the army, and it would be literally now an insurrectionary or suppression of insurrection, so to speak, and what are the consequences for the democratic movement in that regard as well. But the sheer intensity and the brutality of that was something that we did not foresee at the time.
Yes. Now, I want to ask you a related question, but on a personal note, because I just cannot personally imagine that I speak to a man at 10 o'clock at night, and the following day his body is discovered, not just being stabbed, but also being bent. So I want to put myself in a position of how his close friends, like you, Matthew's close friends, Fort Calata's close friends, Sparom Konto's close friends, Sicelo Mhlawuli's close friends, how they felt at that moment.
Look, it's but time heals all wounds, eh? But I can tell you, I've never forgiven the people for what they've done. It's just very difficult. There were other options available to take us out of the equation, and for me personally, I still feel pain to this very day. And none of us went through any counseling because of that horrendous period. I'm not talking about just that incident, but there were other comrades whose lives were lost as well, and what they did to our families during that period. So the wounds of that past we almost immediately went into nation building, if you like, but we didn't as a nation go through a real cathartic process of healing the anger of the past as well. And remember, the impact of this is not only immediately on their family, but it has social and transgenerational consequences in those communities, resonating many decades beyond that as well. So trauma is not just a transient thing. It is something that replicates itself over many, and you can see this in studies of the Nazi repression during the Second World War. In the Netherlands, there are scientific studies that have been done about transgenerational trauma. And it's not only manifest in social consequences, also epigenetic consequences in, in the biology, the health of those families, long after, mental health also, many decades after. But there are studies done about that. And so at a personal level, I think it really was a depressing period, to be honest.
Is everything okay there?
Perhaps, can we take an adjournment?
Yes, maybe we should. Go to the adjourn for a short time.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
Our client actually. these crimes we're dealing with, these 4 crimes, is that even though the names of the likely perpetrators were known as early as the time of the Zitzman inquiry in 1993, there was no attempt to prosecute them, to put a criminal charge of murder. Now, I'm not going to ask you to deal with that. That's a matter that will be dealt with in the course of this inquiry. But what I want to comment on is what the impact of that has been in relation to what you've referred to as cross-generational trauma. The fact that no one is held accountable, but your father has been killed in such a gruesome fashion.
It means that history has an unwritten chapter in your life, your own process of healing, not just as an individual, but remember, individuals are part of a cosmos, a social cosmos. We can't analyze the individuals as atoms outside of their communities. And what stories are they going to tell their children? What memories can they tell about the deceased in a way that can give them a sense of closure as well? Unless there's full knowledge of that, unless this inquest brings that out, I just cannot see how we can have a solid foundation to build on for the families to have a sense of restoration at multiple levels and to begin the process of healing, which is a process that has to take place at multiple levels as well. And if we can't do it as a microscopic group of people, a relatively small group of people that suffered from extreme trauma, what else can we offer to a nation that still is angry in many sorts of ways and wreaked with huge sociological challenges, as such? And so I sincerely believe that this process hopefully will lead to a solid foundation for the process to begin of real healing.
And finally, in the TRC, you were asked, I think it was by Mr. Bezos, about why these 4 were chosen for this level of barbarism. There is the one theory that it's the perception that they were causing the instability in the township, which is a wrong perception. But there is also, another larger, state-centric, which is this was part and parcel of a larger state operation coordinated from the top. So I wonder, with the benefit of hindsight, knowing fully well, for instance, about the signal that was disclosed in 1992, whether you've had further reflections on the selection of these targets for this method of killing and how that connects to a larger state policy.
Well, I think there was a shift, certainly towards the mid-1985 period of the regime, unable to control the proliferation of protests and resistances occurring at multiple levels and at different time scales and at different scales of mobilization and impact, that the state was unable to control and to suppress, let alone suppress these actions. And remember, it had an agenda to try to work itself out of the crisis, and the crisis was spiraling out of control. Globally, the regime was being cut off from financial. We had a sanctions campaign to cut the banking system and the investment flows into the country. Chase Manhattan, you may remember the famous callback that they had on the South African accounts. In the sporting worlds, we sent the late Makenkezi Stofile over to Australia to campaign against the rugby team traveling, because we could not want the regime to have a semblance of normality in a context of a deeply abnormal society. So the regime was finding it, exceedingly, difficult to contain the crisis. And the stock responses that it tended to resort to, in my humble opinion, is a reflex of the authoritarian nature of that regime, that fundamentally it operates on the basis of violence, structural violence through deprivation of people that we don't see in an obvious political way. The rendition of poverty and unemployment in the townships, and the high levels of inequality, and then also political and military violence, again. So my own analysis of the time is that I think it began to revisit its toolbox during that period. And it wanted to, obviously, I suspect, wanted to use the gruesome nature of the assassination to disguise the crime. And I think, secondly, also to terrify the population. Because in Chile in 1973, when Pinochet, I'm just talking now, no, you didn't ask me about this. When General Pinochet...
you are just being a teacher.
I think I should make closes. In there was a socialist president that was elected, Salvador Allende, in Chile in 1971, I think it was, and a coup d'etat was orchestrated by the military, the generals, led by General Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet, I think it is called, and they killed the president, like an elected president, through electoral means. He just happened to be a Marxist and a socialist. Peaceful, democratic, and the regime overturned all the democratic structures. It then went out of its way to find the activists. Many of them, of course, fled. The ones that were lucky ended up in Europe and so on, and some in the States as well. But those that it found, it brutally tortured in ways disproportionate to any logical or rational way why you had to treat people that way, And they rounded them up in stadiums where they did mass torture of subjects as well as a way to terrify the rest of the population into subjugation. And that worked in the case of Chile for a number of decades until it found democracy. A number of other historical examples of this as far as I'm concerned. So I think there was a second motive to terrorize us into fearing. What it certainly did, it led to the banning the restrictions on the UDF declared at the time when we had the funeral, when we buried our four comrades. Then the regime just lashed out in all directions. So the killing of the Cradock Four precipitated then a massive repression across the system that lasted for 2 to 2.5 years until that too collapsed, because it could no longer stop the tide of history, and that led to the transition to the end of apartheid, of course, at the end of the 80s. Yeah, that's just my personal sense of it, Senior Counsel.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, my dear.
Thank you, Senior Toby. Any questions, Mr. Mala?
I have no questions.
Mr. Dimea?
None, thank you, you lady.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Schoeman. Can you explain to me this concept of non-violent but militant?
Well, the way I would explain it, it might not be conceptually as it would be expressed when I use an academic class and try to construct my thinking on this, is that non-violence, the theory of non-violent resistance come a long way in history, Your Honor. And of course, in South Africa, we use the works of Mahatma Gandhi, as a major proponent of defiance against oppression and rendering an oppressive system unworkable by not cooperating with it, and then within legal means, resisting that to make sure that that system is unable to successfully govern. And if more people can do it, it reaches a critical point at which the system then becomes unimposable on the population, so to speak, as well. So the theory of non-violence has a long history, and of course, as you know, during the civil rights movement, with Martin Luther King Jr., in America, struggling against racial discrimination in North America. It has many other roots elsewhere in the world.
Okay, I think my
militant-
interest is the militant part
Yes.
of it,
Militant
whilst being
means,
non-violent at the same time.
Yes, I was moving there, Your Honor.
Thank you.
The militant part is to say that you must push the boundaries of the legal system to render the institutional order that you live under unworkable or ungovernable. Because once people lose faith in when the law is illegitimate, you see, as long as people believe the law is legitimate, then they will obey. Maybe they're not happy with it and so on. But if we can make sure that through that process of confronting the what some colleague or theologian many years called the banality of evil. Hannah Arendt was a theorist that wrote about the experiences of the Nazis during the Second World War. And she was talking about the absurdity of evil. I mean, the stupidity of apartheid, that we had these laws that just was an absolute, did not make any sense. It was just absolutely irrational. And if you can reflect that more and more and more to show the banality of this evil, the idiocy of the system, people will lose their belief in the legitimacy of the law. And militant actions were to push the boundaries on that, to say that this entire system is founded on a profoundly illegitimate basis. It is dressed up as law, It's canonized in law and legislation, but it has no legitimacy because the people do not subscribe to its tenets as well. I think it is in that context that mass mobilization occurred to render different parts of the system unworkable, including, of course, the institutional orders that they used to impose on the black population.
Right. There has been reference during your examination to a G plan, and later it was referred to as the Gqeberha plan. You confirm that what it stands for, the Gqeberha plan?
Yes, ma'am.
Are there any questions arising from court's questioning? Mr. Coltman, Mr. Vani, Mr. Ngaitobi? All right. Okay, at this stage we'll... what time is it? Oh no, it's still early. Thank you, Mr. Swartz. Thank you for being... for detaining us by being a teacher that you are.
My apologies, Chair.
You are excused. You may step down.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Mr. Coltman. All right, court will adjourn.
All right.
in Lingelihle, and then he extended that for another 3 months at the end of June. And on the 27th of May, the police and the SADF cordoned off Lingelihle Township, searching for whom they called public violence suspects. From the 11th of April, conflict in Lingelihle had escalated, where the houses of councillors were stoned. On the 26th of April, the home of Gqeberha Makaula, who was the chairman of the Cradock Residents Association at the time, was petrol bombed.
Mr. Calata, I'm going to ask you to pause for a moment. This detail is reflected in the record, and we will certainly be referring the judge to the blow-by-blow account of what took place, certainly between 83, 84, and 85. But perhaps we can just fast forward a little bit, taking into account that while your father and the others were detained, there was mass protest happening. And then they were eventually released in October of 1984. Am I right in saying that not only was Matthew Gqeberha relieved of his duties, but similar action was taken against your father? And do you recall when that happened?
Yeah. My father was fired from his job as a teacher while he was in detention. The state had asked him why he wasn't in class teaching, which for me is, I don't understand how that works, because he probably would have been in class teaching if they hadn't detained him, ma'am. So when I suppose when they weren't happy with his response, they then said that again that he had effectively dismissed himself because he wasn't in class teaching, which meant that my mother was basically the sole breadwinner for us while my father was in detention. But she too was fired from her job. She had worn a T-shirt to work, and on the chest of the T-shirt it said "Free Mandela," and obviously that started the disciplinary process against her. And then she was fired. So I'm not quite certain of the date, ma'am, in terms of when exactly my mom was fired. But while my father was still in police detention, we would travel to Johannesburg to go and see him. And she told him that she had been fired, and he told her that he had been fired.
I've also been fired.
Sorry?
I have also been fired.
I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am. So for a period, both our parents were unemployed.
So did it appear to your parents that the state was doing everything they could to make life as difficult for you as a family?
Yes, it certainly appeared so, ma'am. When you don't have money, or your only focus is obviously to try and ensure that you are able to provide, for your family. Ma'am, in 1984, my mother was 25 my father was 28. They had 2 children, myself and my older sister, Dorothy. Both of them were now dismissed from their jobs. My father's was clearly politically motivated, and my mother's, again, very similar, because only crime she had committed was to wear a t-shirt that said Free Mandela. So to them, and my mother has retold the story to us over the years, that it was clear that the apartheid government and the system at the time was trying to kind of like economically shut them down, hoping that if they don't have money, if there's no salary coming in, that maybe they might consider their political activism and they might want to focus on, being good little boys and girls and do as the state says, have a salary and raise a family. But I don't think our family was like that.
Mr. Calata, we are in fact going to be hearing from your mother tomorrow. So let's move on. If I can draw your attention to page 9 of your statement at paragraph 29. And just to remind you about your earlier evidence, you said that your father and Matthew Gqeberha and the others were detained at the end of March of 1984.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that the state wished to remove them out of the community. And at paragraph 29.1, you say, for us it all started at a State Security Council meeting on 19th of March 1984. Can you explain to the court why you and your family believe all of this, or at least the steps that were to be taken against your father and the others, started at this fateful meeting on the 19th of March 1984?
Well, ma'am, according to the records, that was when the then Minister of Black Education, Barend Jacobus du Plessis, called for the removal of Cradock teachers Matthew Gqeberha and Fort Calata.
Can you have a quote at
Yes.
paragraph 29.1, which comes from the minute of that particular meeting?
Yes.
And Milady, if one looks at the index to the Lukhanyo Calata bundle, it's actually at item 1, pages 1 to 7.
Yes.
So could you just read into the record the quote from that minute, Mr. Calata?
Right. Ma'am, the quote reads as follows. In Cradock, there are 2 ex-teachers who are acting as agitators. It would be good if they could be removed.
Milady, that's an English translation of the Afrikaans original.
I could read the Afrikaans one if you'd help me find it.
It's okay, we don't have to do that now.
All right.
And then, Mr. Calata, you say in your statement at paragraph 29.2, and here you're relying on the amnesty application of one Jacob Jan Hendrik van Jaarsveld, known as Jaap van Jaarsveld. Something happened only 48 hours later. Can you indicate to the court what that was?
Yeah. So, as the advocate points out, ma'am, some 48 hours later, after the education minister had referred to my father as an agitator, that, would be good if they could be removed, the security branch intelligence sent operatives Jacob Jan Hendrik or Jaap van Jaarsveld and Basie Bouwer to assess the most appropriate way of killing Gqeberha and Calata. Van Jaarsveld cautioned against attempting to kill the targets in Cradock and proposed that they be taken out on a deserted road.
And milady, just for the record, if I can draw your attention to item 2 on the bundle and the extracts from that Amnesty Committee decision is at pages 8 to 9 of the bundle. And so just in terms of timing, Mr. Calata, we have this recorded minute calling for the removal of the 2 agitating teachers on the 19th of March, and you mentioned earlier in your evidence that they were detained, I believe on the 30th of March, and taken far away from the community. Do you recall where they were taken?
Yes. As earlier stated, Judge, my father and Pumbula Lukhanyo, they were taken to the Deep Kloof prison in Johannesburg. Matthew Gqeberha and Budmadoda Jacobs, they were taken to Paulsmoor prison in Cape Town.
And do you see a connection between the call for the removal at the State Security Council meeting and then what subsequently happened when they were detained and removed to Deep Kloof in Johannesburg?
Yes, I do, ma'am. I believe that there is a firm connection between the call for the removal and them ultimately then being removed from the community and then being detained. I don't believe that it was a coincidence that it happened like that. I think it was planned for it to happen in the manner in which it did.
And then it appears from your statement that things moved on fairly rapidly. You've already spoken about the mass mobilization that took place throughout 1984 and their release, which then brings us into 1985. And at paragraph 29.3, there is an interesting signal that is sent from Port Elizabeth Joint Management Committee through to the State Security Council Secretariat. Can you just indicate what that particular signal was about and who sent it?
Yeah. Ma'am, on the 23rd of May 1985, the head of the South African Defence Force in the Eastern Cape and also the chairperson of the State Security Council's Joint Management Committee, Christoffel Pierre Joffel van der Westhuizen, ordered that a signal be sent to the Secretariat of the SSC recommending that Calata, my father, and Gqeberha should never be appointed to any post as teachers ever again.
And milady, in the bundle, that's item 3, and the signal is included at pages 10 to 17 of the bundle. And then just a few weeks later, Mr. Calata, on the 6th of June 1985, there was a meeting of the Joint Security Action Committee chaired by Adrian Vlok. What transpired at that meeting?
Well, on the meeting of the 6th of June at the SSC's Joint Security Action Committee, known by its Afrikaans acronym Gqeberha, this meeting was chaired, ma'am, by Adrian Vlok, who was the Deputy Minister of Law and Order at the time. He sought recommendations on what to do about Gqeberha. A subcommittee was appointed under Brigadier Pieter Johannes Jacobus, otherwise known as Jannie Geldenes, to make these recommendations on what to do about Gqeberha.
And my lady, the minutes of that meeting, item 4, pages 18 to 20 of the bundle. And then Mr. Calata, just one day later, the infamous signal was transmitted. Can you tell the court what you know about that particular signal?
Ma'am, on the 7th of June 1985, Joffel van der Westhuizen ordered Army officer Colonel Lawrence du Plessis to send a top secret and priority signal to Major General Johannes van Rensburg at the Secretariat of the SSC, recommending the urgent, permanent removal from society of Gqeberha, Matthew, Calata, Fort, and Umbulelo Gqeberha, the nephew of Matthew Gqeberha.
And my lady, that signal is at page 21 of the bundle. And then, Mr. Calata, while we're on this timeline, at paragraph 29.6, you make reference to yet another State Security Council meeting that took place on the 10th of June 1985. What transpired at that meeting?
Well, at the meeting on the 10th of June, ma'am, which came less than 3 days after the signal was sent to the SSC Secretariat, Deputy Minister Adrian Flock indicated that he would take steps to allow for the JMCs to act on their own initiative. The key masterminds behind the operation sat on the Eastern Province JMC.
And Milady, the minutes of that meeting are in the bundle at pages 22 to 26. And Mr. Calata, we will return at a later stage to deal with the with those behind the planning and execution of the murders. But then you carry on with the story at paragraph 29.7, and you say that on or about the 12th of June 1985, some people got together. What transpired on that day?
On the 12th of June, Security Branch Officer Saki van Zyl and his team commenced planning for an operation to murder Gqeberha and my father.
And, Milady, for that we rely on the transcripts of Saki van Zyl's evidence before the Amnesty Committee. It's at pages 68 to 78 of the bundle. And the actual conversation between his counsel and Mr. van Zyl takes place at around pages 71 to 72, where they speak of the planning taking place a few weeks before, and then ultimately Mr. van Zyl says it was around 2 to 3 weeks before the murders were carried out on the 27th of June. And then, Mr. Calata, what transpired just a short time later, some 2 weeks later, as you indicate at paragraph 29.8 of your statement?
So, ma'am, 2 weeks after Saki van Zyl and his team had begun planning for this operation, on Thursday, 27 June 1985, my father, Fort Calata, and his comrades, Matthew Gonyu, Sparom Konto, and Stelom Shauli, were abducted on a deserted road as recommended previously by Van Jaarsveld a year earlier, and they were murdered. Ma'am, as far as we understand, the killers on the scene that night were Major Johan Martin Saki van Zyl, Lieutenant Eric Taylor, Sergeant Gerardus Lotz, Sergeant Amos Fagu, Sergeant Glenn Mgoduga, and Shepherd Shakat.
Thank you, Mr. Calata. Milady, it is 4 p.m. Would this be appropriate time for the adjournment?
Yes, perhaps we should adjourn for the day. Okay, we'll adjourn to resume tomorrow at 9:30, and that court will adjourn for the day.
As the court is